Hey there hunters, and welcome back to more Remnant 2 build videos. Today again we have a lot to cover as we need to fix some of our old mod builds since this new patch, and make a few new ones for the updated mods. Like the shotguns build video, we're going to be going over some of the older builds first, summarizing them and what changed, and then we're going to dive into the new builds, so let's just get into this. And as a quick appetizer, here's the average DPS of both of the new builds, Prismatic Driver and Astral Skewer Swapper. They're both absolutely nasty, but with that, let's just get into the builds. Starting back with the original Electromancer build I did a long time ago, which is the pure shock and overload setup. Originally we were running this with prime time to get double use of Way of Kayula and Deathwish, and while you can still do that, you should also now make use of Sadistic to get some really nice juicy overload pops. You can pop for about 9 to 11k on a single target with an overload, and that's pretty cool to see. The DPS is still fairly terrible. This is more of a thematic and fun build more than anything serious, but it still does clear Apocalypse just fine. It's just not amazing at anything. No other changes to this build other than swapping to Sadistic, but I still really like it, and it's kind of fun to see those huge overloads. So yeah. Moving on, we have the standard explosive mod swapper with Helix and Deadpoint. No changes to this build. We're still pushing about 9 to 10k of non-weak spot damage with permanent sustained, easy peasy. However, this build is going to be obsolete because while explosives are obviously good, they do come with some downsides that they need a remedy, such as running kinship, because you can kill yourself if enemies get too close, and the Deadpoint AoE is absolutely huge, and that's just a lot of unnecessary risks. So we're actually not going to be running explosive mod swapper in favor of the non-explosive swapper, which we're going to cover in a little bit. So this build is basically deleted. And then we have the Spearlock tank build. I made a few changes since I originally posted this build. First is that we aren't running Nebula anymore for obvious reasons, and instead I've opted for Night cards as my new Fire and Forget mod, as it kind of fits thematically even though they don't scale with melee damage, which is kind of sad. This is more for show. You're probably better off running like Corrupted Rune Pistol and Fetid Wounds for more damage if you want to go that route, but this is all about melee and mods, and the Night cards fit. So I've also changed out the Gigantic Legendary Fragment for the Immovable Fragment for stagger resistance, because at least this way we're not going to drop out of our spear throws, which does cost us some of our bulk unfortunately. I'd also taken off the Haymaker ring, which lost us 18% damage, and put on the Hardcore Heavy Metal band for Bulwark stacks, so we can always have those up for the Immovable Fragment. Plus, it gets us a little bit more of our damage reduction back, which we still need. Now, Spearlock of course isn't the greatest DPS around. It typically sits around 8k or so in optimal conditions, so it's not anything to write home about, but it's definitely the most unique functional build in that it scales with melee and uses the mod buttons only. But that's it for the Spearlock build. Moving on, we have Anguish. Now, Anguish did receive a slight nerf, but it still pushes 9k DPS while only needing to hold down one button, so there's nothing wrong with that. We did make some changes to the build though, which makes it even tankier. First is that we don't run Monolith anymore. Instead, we're going to be using Harvester bots for a bunch more leech. You can use whatever weapon you want with that. I specifically went for the Bulldog for the burst damage during Lydusa's wall phase though. Next is that we got rid of Chakra and our mod duration fragments, since the base duration of Loathe the Weak is now 15 seconds, which pairs perfectly with Bullet Weaver, and we don't want to mess that up. So we can instead grab like Hulk on our Prism for more HP and stamina, as well as something like Potency or a Strongback for more armor and consumable duration on our traits. So while we did lose a little bit of our top end damage from losing Sandstorm damage and exposure, we did get a fair bit of extra defenses, which is a fair trade. Anguish still pumps and still performs much better in my opinion than the Prismatic Driver, so let's get into that build before people start yelling at me. So we have the new and improved Prismatic Driver. I feel like everyone out here is running the wrong setup for this, and they're definitely overhyping the build. They're trying to do weak spot damage with the mod and scaling that, but the bigger seller here is the explosion pops you get, so I'm leaning 100% into that. And going this route, we can push about 9k DPS over like 300,000 damage on a training dummy, which is excellent for a mod build that you just hold down. And this was about the best I could do with the Prismatic Driver while still having 100% sustain on the mod. Now, Prismatic Driver on paper has better initial DPS compared to something like Anguish, but Prismatic Driver has its own problems too. So let's dive into the build so I can explain that. To start, we're going to be running Archon and Summoner for the archetypes. Go figure, it's a mod with explosives. There's not really any other option here. Also, if you don't know why, it's because Summoner gives 70% damage to explosive mods, and you just can't beat that. Anyway, Chaos Gate on the Archon is going to be our only useful skill, but we're still going to be using our summons just to put them on cooldown. So I do go with Reaver, but he's definitely going to get exploded by the Prismatic Driver pops. For our weapons, you're free to choose anything you want, but for me, I'm going to be running Bulldog with the Prismatic Driver, and we're going to be pairing this with the Feedback Mutator, because the pops from the Prismatic Driver will refund a lot of mod power due to feedback, and that's going to help sustain our infinite Prismatic Driver. For your second gun, you pretty much have all the options available to you. I'm using a revolver with abrasive rounds and fetid wounds just to apply bleed and corrosion, but you can easily run Night Guards or any mod, like Scrap Shot or Song of Earfur to slow down enemies, or you can run Corrupted Rune Pistol for Deathbrand. Just make sure you have Twisted Wounds on those because we're going to need that bleed. For the most part though, we're just going to be using Prismatic Driver, and the secondary should just be something that you can just, fire and forget and just use occasionally. So the trinkets, we've hammered in that we're going to be using bleed, and so I'm sure you can see where this is going, because that's right, we're returning to the old glory days of running the Abrasive Whetstone. Crit and crit damage, yes, we're stacking crit. So obviously that means our rings are going to be the Return of the Classics, Braided Thorn, Burn the Gambler, and Probability Cord. It's just crit and crit damage, woohoo. Now the last ring does need a little bit of explaining. We're going to be using Burden of the Mariner for mod generation, and you might be thinking, why on earth would you use that when you can use Burden of the Follower to always have 30% mod gen? Well, that's because of the fire rate. Prismatic Driver is weird because it does get affected by your fire rate, so you can dump charges faster with more fire rate. However, that messes up the explosion ticks, and they kind of get really wonky with slower or faster fire rate, and not in a good way. It becomes inconsistent and basically lowers your DPS. This is true for both having higher fire rate and lower fire rate, so we really need to be at the base fire rate values. We don't want to use Burden of the Follower because then we're going to have to offset our fire rate. And so it's easier just to run Burden of the Mariner and make sure your skills are active or on cooldown. So whenever the Reaver dies, it's got like a huge 2-minute cooldown, and so we have Mariner pretty much always up. Side tangent is yes, that I did see that the lower frame rate was boosting Prismatic Driver damage, and I did test that, and I found it to be pretty anecdotal and inconsistent over many tests. Lowering the frame rate is like lowering the fire rate. It can occasionally burst faster and then slow down and not burst for a while. It's just weird and inconsistent. I don't like it, and it didn't seem to have any consistent impactful difference, so keep your frame rate. Moving on to the Prism. I'm here running Power Fantasy for 30% crit and crit damage. Reason being is that we're going this route just so we can get more pops on our Prismatic Driver explosion, and we can get 95% crit chance while gaining 30% more crit damage in the process. And honestly, we'd probably have to run Whetstone and Burden the Gambler anyway, even if we did Wrecking Ball, so we might as well just get the crit, because this way we get both the crit and the crit damage, and we're still going to have 65% crit chance for the beam ticks, which are still doing a pretty good amount of damage. If we could scale anything else, then Wrecking Ball would probably be better, but there's not very many items that scale mod damage well enough, and then we don't obviously want to scale fire rate, unfortunately. So crit's kinda all we got. The rest of the Prism is self-explanatory, given what we're doing. We have Sapper for damage, Wizard for crit, Mage for mod stuff, Revitalize just because you get a free slot and it's some regen, and then crit damage is our free fragment. We don't need weak spot damage, obviously. On the trait side, some weird stuff. We have Affliction literally just here for bleed durations, so we don't have to swap back to Magnum all that often. Spirit and Insight for Prismatic Driver sustain, Fortified Vigor, Bark Skin for tankiness, and then be sure to get Kinship because that explosion can't kill you. And then the rest of the points are up to you. I have Endurance for stamina, as that always helps when you're trying to roll away from enemies, but you can go Untouchable for some iframes. Swiftness and Footwork also do well since you're going to be holding your laser down the entire time, and so you can kind of like dodge while you're shooting. Just don't get Potency because we really don't need it. So with all the gear out of the way, how is Prismatic Driver? Well, again, I think people are overhyping it. Yes, it's strong. It pops for about 6k, it does about 9k DPS, don't need any weak spots, pretty much has infinite sustain. What's not to love? Well, what's not to love is the explosion on the Prismatic Driver. You'll notice I don't have amplitude, and that's because the pops from Prismatic Driver will throw your player much like a Hellfire explosive shot. And because of that, it's basically a death sentence in Apocalypse boss rush. So whenever you're in a tight quarter, such as Nerud areas, or you have bosses that are up in your face, you have to be extremely careful about where you're throwing that laser. And this is also going to cause you to stop and back up to make sure you're in a safer position before you get those bursts to pop. So while Prismatic Driver is strong, it's also extremely risky, which is the same for any other explosive mod I suppose, but compared to something like Anguish or Corrupted Meridian, those can hit you and push you around, but they don't knock you on the floor, which again is a huge amount of time spent on the floor and you're just gonna die. So Anguish, in my opinion, ends up feeling much safer. Prismatic Driver is great, I'm not saying it's not, but I think the hype is a little bit overblown. Yes, it's very strong, but it's not the strongest mod built around, and it does have inherent risks with the explosion aspect. It's just easy to use, which is fine, and I do like it, but I think I'd still prefer Anguish. But anyway, let's move on to the actual best mod build. And that's going to be the Astral Skewer Swapper. And look, I don't like to use clickbait language like this is the best, most overpowered build ever, but this is actually that. So this is the mod swapper with Astral Burst and Skewer, and I knew they were going to be the best mods in the game as soon as I read the patch notes, because they both got double damage, and they weren't that bad before. Explosives are just better. They didn't need double damage, but here we are now, and they're absolutely insane, and they have no downsides at all. You don't need to land precision shots, you don't need to manage your mod power, you don't need to have any risk of self-deletion, nothing. So let's get into this build that just cruises through everything in the game on Apocalypse without any problems whatsoever. So the cool thing about this build is you have a lot of freedom with your archetypes. You can run any combination of Archon paired with either Challenger, Alchemist, Warden, Medic, or Summoner, whatever you want. Reason being is that we don't actually need Archon Prime to sustain our mod swap. It's easier, but it's not required. And we also don't get to double dip in damage from Summoner like explosive mods do, so that's just a 35% damage boost and that's all. So really, you just want the all damage from your second class. Ritualist I don't really recommend, even though Death Wish is great, but we're not really going to be applying statuses. But you can run like Alchemist, which provides concoctions and frenzy dust. You can run Challenger for stagger resistance, or even an extra life if you want. You can run Warden and Medic to give you a lot more defensive options, and none of these really sacrifice much damage. So you're free to pick whatever, and you'll be just fine, trust me. For my build, I'm going with Archon and Alchemist. You can run Alchemist Prime. In the clips here, I was running Archon Prime, but after testing, I found that it wasn't really necessary to get that extra mod power. So you can run more concoctions with Alchemist if you want. That's going to be my game plan going forward, but for now, in this build, we're doing Archon Prime. For the weapon, you can pick whatever you want. You're going to be using them just for the open mod slots, and that's it. Obviously, we have Astral Burst, and I'm going to be pairing that with Bullet Weaver, and then we have Skewer with Feedback. Reason for running Astral Burst with Bullet Weaver is that because subsequent shots from these mods are affected by your fire rate, so with more fire rate, you can dump the 3 charges of Astral Burst faster, which means more DPS. This is also the reason why we run Alchemist, because we get Frenzy Dust for more fire rate. Fire rate isn't hugely important, but it is another avenue of scaling our DPS, and so where we can do it, we're taking it. Feedback on Skewer because it costs more mod power to refund, and it does 2 instances of hits, which both grant more mod power back to keep our fuel going. We don't need Prophecy to sustain our swapping at all. Moving on to the trinkets, Reaction Chain is absolutely mandatory. This is hands down the best single item in the game. It enables the use of mod swap builds freely. 50% refund is absolutely absurd, and I do expect it to get nerfed. Next, we have a choice between the Dull Steel Ring, which seems like a weird choice, but with the concoctions from Alchemist, you can get up to like 74 weight and still be on lightweight. So we can almost go full Letos and get some massive damage reduction. And then you still have no stamina penalty, and you have better dodges. It's kind of crazy. Or you can just go with 10% crit from Braided Thorns. Your choice, a little bit of DPS or a little bit of damage reduction. We're also going to be running Burden of the Gambler. While these mods do hit weak spots, you'd probably be thinking that you'd want to do the weak spot damage for your DPS, but really the extra crit and crit damage, which also boosts the secondary burst from Skewer, which doesn't weak spot, tends to be equal to running Xania's Malice and keeping a weak spot damage anyway. And then you don't need to worry about aiming at all. So we're going to be doing non-weak spot crit stacking for this setup. And so with that, we're going to be going with probability chords since we're going to have like 85% crit chance. And so we need that crit damage, of course. Now technically, Astral Burst is bugged Burden of the Gambler in that it does get some bonus weak spot damage if you do land on weak spots still. But even while shooting at center mass of the target dummy and not using weak spots at all, it still pushes the same DPS as the weak spot version, which is around 14k. And again, that doesn't require you to hit anything. So even when they fix it, that won't affect this build at all. The last ring slot, again, is going to be Burden of the Mariner. Since we do care about our fire rate, since we're not doing just the single mod and swap, we're going to be dumping our mods, then swapping. Plus, we're going to be dropping both of our skills at the start of every boss fight anyway, so the cooldowns won't be an issue where it matters. Moving on to the concoctions, which do matter, because we're going to want to make sure that we have lightweight. We're going to want to run the strong drink and the egg drink to give us some more weight and some encumbrance threshold, so we can be up to lightweight at 50 encumbrance. You can cycle your snake oil to get either strong drink or egg drink and then use the other and you'll be good. If you don't want to go that route though, you can just drop a little bit of armor and be at 40 weight, which should only reduce your damage reduction by like 4% or something. Or again, you can just run the dual steel ring. With the engineer armor and 50 weight being lightweight, we have 54% damage reduction, and you can go up to like near full Letos with dual steel ring, which is going to get you about 59 or 60% damage reduction. And then if you drop down to the 40 weight, as I said, you're going to have about 49% damage reduction. So that's kind of your range. Pick whatever you're comfortable with. For the Prism, you might be able to guess by now, but we're going to be running Critical Situation for that 35% crit. There aren't a lot of good options for mod builds, as we don't need very much mod generation thanks to Reaction Chain, and we don't need more charges. That doesn't do anything for anyone. So really the two choices we have are Jack of all trades or Critical Situation. So crit it is. With this, our Prism is going to grant us 50% crit chance, and we're going to get the other 35% from our archetypes, Burden the Gambler, and Braid of Thorns if you're going to be running that. Outside of the generic Wizard and Mage fusions, you can run Fire Rate, Swap Speed, Critical Damage, all to fill out your DPS, but I also opted to get Revitalize for some skill cooldown and a little bit of regen. Fairly simple Prism here, do whatever you feel like, just make sure you get Wizard and Mage. Regarding the traits, we actually have a lot of room to play with since we only need Spirit, Insight, and Strongback. I've opted for my usual Vigor, Fortify, Barkskin, Siphoner for some mad bulk, but I also finished off my traits with Endurance and Untouchable. So I got some great tankiness as well as some more iframes. I'm on lightweight. It's all good. We don't need Kinship since we don't have any chance of killing ourselves, and we also don't need Chakra. Gifted is fine, but also wouldn't say it's necessary. And that's basically all the gear here for the Astral Skewer Swapper build. Playstyle is a lot comfier compared to the explosive mod swappers, because not only do you not have a risk of killing yourself, but also you don't have to do that, mod, shot, and swap constantly, which does save your fingers. You can shoot 3 bursts, swap the 2 skewers, swap back. It just feels nicer. The damage here is absolutely bonkers, probably the most consistent and strongest build in the game outside of Monorail against weak spot bosses, and that's no lie and no bait. I don't see anything else pushing 14k DPS on non-weak spots, and also not exploiting Boar or other nonsense. Yes, Gambler still lets you hit weak spots with Astral Burst, but again, even against body shots, we're still doing 14k DPS. This is just a nutty setup, and the power creep is absolutely real. I can't believe how or why we got to this stage of having double damage for these two mods, but, here we are. Anyway, yeah, nothing's beating this, so the future builds that we're going to cover are going to be downhill from here, but it's okay, we're just here to have fun, right? So that's going to be all for me for now. Thank you all for watching, and good luck out there, hunters.